Okay, how many of you guys know anything at all about fuel trim?
If it's negative, I mean, if it's negative, it's burning rich or something like that.
That sounds pretty accurate. Fuel trim is a response to what the engine controller is picking up at the oxygen sensor. Basically what it is. Now, another thing you need to understand is what open loop fuel control is, well, closed loop fuel control. So if you've got a closed loop system, you've got a system that's able to see how it's doing and make adjustments. The air conditioner over here is a perfect example of a closed loop system. It's measuring the temperature, and it can turn on the air conditioning unit to alter the temperature so that it's satisfied. So my wristwatch is an open loop system. This is not one of those watches that talks to the atomic clock. This is just a plain old Timex Expedition. And so what it does is, see that thing right here picked up some temperature changes and it's trying to fix the temperature in the room. That's a closed loop system. This is an open loop system. I look at it and it ain't gonna set itself. All it's gonna do is just gonna, if it gets off, it don't even know it. It just knows that it's running. Well, on your fuel injection system, back when they first started doing them, there was not really any closed loop system on that as far as the air fuel mixture went. So you're wanting, technically the stoichiometric clean burn mix is 14.7 to 1. One of these days I'm going to break out my exhaust gas analyzer and show you what all that means. But the point of the matter is, that's the perfect mix, 14.7 to 1 by weight. And you're basically measuring the fuel, the weight of the fuel and the weight of the air. If you went by volume, you're burning 9,000 gallons of air for each gallon of fuel. You're also making a gallon of water for every gallon of fuel you burn. All right, so fuel trim factors that affect it. You might even notice it got a little scan tool thing going on here. Short fuel trim, bank 1, 25%. That means it has added fuel because the oxygen sensor had gone lean. What you want to do when you're looking at one that comes in with a problem that nobody's been working on is you're going to look at your long fuel trims. Because what the long fuel trim does is it corrects based on what it sees the short fuel trim doing. Like for example, let's say somebody, this big vacuum leak that was on the Expedition, and sucking that air in there. The oxygen sensor, after everything is burned, see the engine controller starts out putting what it knows is close to the right amount in there. Oxygen sensor is telling it's reading oxygen. It don't smell gas. It smells oxygen. So it's going up there saying, hey, I'm running lean down here. And the engine controller says, well, let's see if we can fix that. And it starts to put a little more fuel in there. It's like turning a knob. Imagine you being the engine controller turning a knob while you're watching the oxygen sensor. I'm going to keep turning that knob till that bad boy comes up. All right, it went up, now I'm going to turn it the other way and go down. I'm going to be turning it back and forth the whole time. See, the oxygen sensor is responding to what I'm doing with my trim. The engine controller doesn't have a knob, but it may as well have. That's what this is all about. So, if this one's at 25 and it stays there very long, this one here is going to start moving. And it's eventually going to go up to where this one is, and when it gets up to where that one is, it's got it enough off balance to where this can go back to 0. But the whole system now has been shifted. You see, that's what long fuel trim is about. There's a bunch of different ways people explain that, but I like to say that long fuel trim is a course adjustment, and it's designed to put short fuel trim back at, if it can put short fuel trim back at 0, you're running clean again. But it's having to hold everything out of balance to do it. And you want it to be sitting here like this. You don't want it sitting here going, trying to keep it. All right, now, the older airflow sensor looked like this on the inside. What you basically had was everything slides across that strata, and there was a vane connected to that. There was actually an L-shaped vane, and whenever it would, the air would come in, that vane would move against this weak spring that you see, and it would pull that over. It's something else that these older ones would do. You see that little set of points right there? That little set of points actually was what the fuel pump was wired through those. And so as soon as that mass airflow started to move, it would let those points close, and that would turn on the fuel pump. Now this right here was on a Toyota, one of them funky little mid-engine Toyotas. I can't forget what the name of it was. But anyway, we worked on one of them here, and that was a picture of that when that took off. The only problem with that is these right here are sort of not very common anymore. If you wanted to buy one for that Toyota that we were working on, MR2 or whatever it was, it would be like $800 for one of these sensors. Ridiculous money. So anyway, that slider almost looks like a throttle position sensor, but it's driven by airflow instead of your foot, right? Okay, now, mechanical airflow system, like what you had on these Volkswagens, and also the DeLorean had a setup like this. You basically got air coming through here, it would raise that plate up, and sitting on that plate was this fuel distributor piston. And I worked on a lot of these, and coming out of that fuel distributor was the fuel that went to some injectors that were nothing more than atomizers, is all they were. They didn't actually pulse, they just sprayed fuel, and when this raised up, and that little spool valve let more fuel go out there, and they'd spray more fuel. Now, that was a pretty interesting setup, and there was a little adjustment right here, so you could go, you pull a little rubber plug out, and go over the screwdriver, and you could adjust it. To start with, you know, they also had a auxiliary air regulator on them, and this one here had a control pressure regulator that would operate to reduce the amount of pressure right here so they could come up higher when the engine was cold. So you needed cold enriched for that. And VW and DeLorean, along with some other platforms, using that system there, and that's what the fuel distributor looked like. Now, if you ever took one of these things apart, you'd never get it back together, right? So don't even go there. That stuff was measured in microns, and I think everything was cut with lasers that had such tiny holes in it. There's your mechanical airflow system. Again, there, that's literally over. That's a K-Jetronic system. Shows all these components, include a control pressure regulator, reduces hydraulic pressure, you know, on the top of it. There's your control pressure regulator up there. See, so pressure was fed, you know, from the pump. There was an accumulator here, and there's a filter. It comes up here and it goes through there, and this control pressure regulator would operate. These right here could go bad and make them run rich and all that kind of thing. So y'all will probably never have to work on one of those. Probably won't, unless you work on a DeLorean. If you work on a DeLorean, try to drive it under 88 miles an hour. You know why, right?
Kids will travel fast.
He don't know why. Why should I keep my DeLorean under 88 miles an hour?
Kids will time travel.
You never saw Back to the Future? When you drove at 88 miles an hour, you were going back in time, man, to wherever that thing was set at. That was pretty cool. But anyway,
What?
actually the speedometer on a DeLorean only reads 80 miles an hour. On a real DeLorean. I have a friend of mine that owns one. Anyway, the mass airflow on the day system has got priority. To measure the, if you haven't seen Back to the Future, you need to get it, man. That is a good movie. It's fun to watch. You know? To measure the incoming air, the PCM on a mass airflow system doesn't need to know anything about throttle position, exhaust gas recirculation flow, engine temperature, or barometric pressures. It can use other inputs to infer mass airflow if the mass airflow is disconnected, and on many systems, a shorted mass airflow sensor can cause a nose start. I've actually gone out there and found that. Tell you something else, a mass airflow sensor can make you feel like a transmission problem too. You need to be careful about that. A lot of mass airflow sensors have a cold wire that keeps track of ambient temperature and a hot wire that the sensor heats to maintain a constant temperature above the temperature of the cold wire, and the mass airflow signal is calculated based on how much current it takes to do this. So it actually changes that either into a frequency or a voltage that the engine controller can use to determine how much air is going in there. So, mass airflow sensors need power. If something else is fed by the same fuse that causes the fuse to blow, you'll get a mass airflow code, but that doesn't mean you need to throw a mass airflow sensor at it. Just because you get a code for a mass airflow sensor doesn't mean the mass airflow sensor is bad. It could be something else. Imagine what would happen if I decided to set a bug on one of these vehicles out here, and I took the air cleaner out and I wrapped it in saran wrap, totally, and I put it back in there. And you'd get mass airflow, you know, indications if you were looking at something, wouldn't you? All right. Check for good voltage at the mass airflow connector if you get a code for a dead mass airflow sensor. So basically, you see you got ignition voltage coming from that fuse. On these, this is a GM one. Mass airflow signal goes over here to measure the PCM. You got, this is just basically ABC. You know, you got voltage, signal, it changes with mass airflow, and then you got your ground. Now, obviously, if you had a ground problem somewhere on this line right here, it'd throw you mass airflow issues too, wouldn't it? All right, unmetered air leaks. What that means is any air that enters the engine without first passing through the mass airflow sensor. Have you ever seen a big old cracked hose like this? Or that big ugly vacuum leak? Now, this can be between the mass airflow sensor and the throttle body. And I have seen some of them, you know, when the engine would torque a little bit. I worked on some vehicles where the engine would torque and it would go, Well, the reason it was doing that is every time it torqued back, it would open up this hole like that in the hose, and it would lose, you know, fuel, and then it would release it, and it would It was just hunt like that. You go out there and you start pulling on a hose, you find a place where it's split open. Be something as simple as that. I actually saw a Ford Probe one time that the mass airflow sensor wire was tight enough to where it would try to unplug the sensor every time. And it was doing that same thing. PCM figures fuel delivery based on mass airflow readings, it'll cut back on the injector pulse, and that causes an out of balance fuel mix that's picked up as a lean condition by the O2 if you got a situation like this. See, it won't always hunt like that, but it will cause issues like that. All right, fuel trims. Get that transmission out of that Suburban. What are you waiting on? Sundown or payday? Hurry up. Fuel trims will climb when the unmetered air leaks are present. They hold the throttle open a bit when there's an unmetered air leak. That drives the fuel trims back toward normal. And that's a good piece of data. If you've got a vacuum leak or an unmetered air leak, at idle you're going to see screwed up fuel trims. You give it enough gas to where there's enough going in there to where it overrides that, it may come back toward normal. So if you see stuff that's normal above idle or driving down the road and it goes crazy when you're stopping, look for an air leak or something like that. All right. Now, in regard to the air fuel mix, the PCM can only change the amount of fuel in the mix. It cannot do anything about the air unless it's a throttle body, electronic throttle body. The PCM controls the fuel delivered only when it's able to accurately measure the air entering the engine. So that's what it's looking at. Now, here's a question. Why do fuel trims go positive when the oil filler cap is removed with the engine running? Looking at my fuel trims on the scan tool screen, take the oil filler cap off, they start to go positive. How does the air get in?
Through the oil filler cap.
But what's pulling it in through the oil filler cap? You're giving good answers, but I want to know what the other side of the story is. What's working to pull air out of the crankcase all the time? What system?
PCM.
What ventilates the crankcase in a positive way? Positive crankcase ventilation. You know your PCV valve? All right. Now, what are you guys thinking about? If you pull that oil filler cap off, the air that's being pulled in through the PCV is going to go into the filler cap, and that turns into an unmetered air leak in the filler cap. Now imagine this. What if you've got an oil filler cap that's not tight, or one that's got a damaged gasket? Could that make your fuel trims go? What if you've got a mass airflow sensor that's reading just a little bit off? That could make it go wacky too, couldn't it? I mean, so you've got to be able to find this, and a lot of times you need to be, a lot of times when I had a mass airflow sensor that I used to have, that I put on the Ranger over there, and I'd say we got really good fuel balance on that thing, and I could put that mass airflow sensor reading just a shade off, and the fuel trims would go completely off the chart. Just because of that mass airflow sensor. But you could not look at those readings and tell that it was objectionable. It was like, if you're looking at voltage, it was like 790 millivolts. And it would be 810 millivolts on the good sensor. You know what I mean? Just a tiny little whisper. All right. Now, speed density systems use a MAP sensor, manifold absolute pressure, which basically is what y'all will be thinking of as measuring vacuum, right? But that's the only part of it. The weight of the air is also calculated, but it requires a PCM to do more math. And that's a far simpler way. Mass airflow is a lot simpler way to measure the weight of the incoming air. These are all factored in on MAP sensor dominant vehicles. RPM, engine volume, throttle plate position, manifold absolute pressure, intake temperature, and barometric pressure. All that stuff's got to be factored in. Now, barometric pressure is also figured in by the mass airflow too, typically. But now a lot of the newer vehicles, as a matter of fact, they don't even have to be all that much newer. That Oldsmobile's got a MAP sensor and a mass airflow sensor on it. Got them both. There was a time whenever they did away with the MAP and GM first started using mass airflow, and those things gave so much trouble, there was actually a retrofit where you could go back and get rid of the mass airflow sensor and put a MAP sensor back on it. Now, that was in the early days. Mass airflow sensors got a lot more intelligent after that. All right, now the PCM's focus, like you got unregulated fuel sources, dripping injectors, saturated canister, high fuel pressure, ruptured diaphragm, fuel contaminated engine oil, can tip all that out of balance as surely as unmetered air will drive the fuel trims to negative. So it subtracts fuel to correct for stuff like a dripping injector, or if that diaphragm and that fuel pressure regulator is busted, fuel can actually go through here and go into the engine. All right, so let's say you got a situation there, like my son's bought this truck, a pickup truck, and it was a 2013 F-150 with a 3.7 in it. And whenever he gassed it up, it would be really hard to start. Every time he gassed it up. The rest of the time it'd do just fine. But when he gassed it up, it was extremely hard to start. What do you think is going to be wrong with that? That problem is not very uncommon, really. All right. Which system it is that handles the hydrocarbons in the gas tank?
The evap.
The evap system, right? Okay, so what if the purge valve was open all the time? When you put gas in there and it's filling up, you're pushing vapor through that purge valve right into the intake if it's open all the time. And then that kind of condenses in there and tries to wet the spark plugs. And you, what the heck is this? You know, sometimes if you pack the gas tank in there and the evaporative system starts, then nowadays the evaporative system can just start purging when it wants to. You know, it'll be sitting there idling, it'll start purging. And if you've packed the gas tank and you've saturated that canister with a lot of gas, as soon as a bunch of gas goes in there, it can almost kill the engine. Then the idle air control will say, oh no, and it'll rev it. And you're sitting here and without warning, all of a sudden it goes boom, bam, and you run into the car in front of you because you were packing a gas tank. You see what I'm saying? And if you're ever looking at somebody that says, sometimes it does this, you look at it and you watch it. When it starts purging, if the engine stumbles a little bit, you say, you're packing a gas tank, aren't you? And they say, well, yeah, usually I have as much gas as I can. All right, short fuel trim is an instantaneous fuel pulse width adjustment to what the O2 sensors are telling the PCM. Now, whenever typically, you know, you got air fuel sensors now and stuff like that that work slightly different. You can see that on your elect tube, by the way. You'll get to the point where it actually shows you a cutaway of how those air fuel sensors and everything are working. But anyway, the oxygen sensor is supposed to be doing this all the time, right? All right, if the oxygen sensor does this, and that fuel starts, you know, it starts trying to pull the fuel trim up so it can start doing that again. Long fuel trims, the adaptive memory part of the picture, and follow short fuel trim, making course adjustments to the fuel delivery algorithm when short fuel trim wobbles forward or left. Back in the day, whenever some of the Dodges had fuel injection with just, you know, the little injectors in the throttle body, you know, you've seen a TPI, throttle body injection, and they had some crummy little ball seats in them injectors would start getting little pocket trim and they would let too much fuel into the engine. And so Dodge wanted to replace all of those on a recall so that it would get all that straightened out. Well, the mechanics wouldn't take the battery cable off and let the PCM forget everything. They just pop an injector in there. And when they popped the injector in there, suddenly it wasn't putting as much fuel in there, the darn thing wouldn't idle. And some of them would get so angry about that, they just put the original injector back in and put it out back out of the shelf because I ain't got time to fool with this. It's a stupid recall anyway. Well, see, if you take the battery cable off when you're doing your repairs, all of the trash that's in the memory from the bad problem goes away. But let's say this. Let's say you found a vacuum leak and you had high fuel trim, you found a vacuum leak, and you're thinking that's how you fixed it. The way you make sure you fixed it is you clear those tables. Some scan tools have it where you can clear them. Take the battery cable off. Go ahead while you're at it, wash the throttle body out. But if it's an electronic throttle body, don't open it with your fingers, have somebody hold the gas pedal, you know, just wash it out real good. Get all that done, and then you've cleared everything. And everybody starts out at zero. All right, this is after you've done your repair. You fire it up. If that thing starts clamming again, you ain't done. You need to go find your leak where it was. Okay. You won't always see the problem with a scan tool. All right, for the people that like to spend a lot of time enjoying the cool AC sitting in the car pretending to look at the scan tool. You ever seen anybody do that? You ever seen somebody do that? Have you ever done that?
I done done it.
All right, yeah, All right. There's only so much you can figure out that way. Pretending to work while playing with your phone doesn't work either. I had some guys in there one time and I'd walk by and look in the car and they'd be playing 8-ball pool on their phone and scan tool was in the seat.
Nah, I'm dead on the ball. I'll be trying to use the
Well, you're not too bad to do that. You're a pretty good hot shot. All right. How much can the mass airflow system know? If there's an exhaust restriction downstream of the cap, like an internally damaged muffler with a baffle blocking its outlet, so the engine can't breathe out, well, how can we find that with a scan tool? What do you think about that? on this Ranger, Alvin Moore, he's another motor rage rider, that's really good stuff. He put a man-made exhaust restriction in place, and in his Ranger, it exhibited low power, like an exhaust would, you stopped up, and the only PID that changed was the load, reading 74% when it should have been reading closer to 95%. The mass airflow had no knowledge of the exhaust restriction. Hello. Hey. The one that says old is the one that's originally came off the truck, and we need one that looks just like that. I'm keeping the old one. I want the original one back, and I need one just like it, but the one that says new is the one that he sent that didn't fit. You got it? All right, so anyway, you see what happened here? What he did, and this is not a bad thing to do, he basically went ahead and put an exhaust restriction in place just to see how it would affect it. You got it? All right. Now, even though this Envoy is struggling to stay at 60 miles an hour, the data PIDs don't show anything out of the ordinary. See that? This goes to show there's more to drivability than just knowing how to read a scan tool. So you may be reading a scan tool and say, well, I don't see anything wrong here, but it's really got a problem. One time I stuck a potato in the exhaust pipe of the Oldsmobile to make an exhaust restriction. Just figured I'd give that a shot, you know, because you hear about people doing that. And the guy that was working on it was parking that stall over there with it back in facing out toward the other building. And he kept fooling with it, building pressure and exhausted. When it blew that tater plug out there, it went all the way across there and hit that wall on the other side. And I said, I ain't gonna do that again. Somebody standing back there and took them out, man. But anyway, all right. So, see these little PIDs that you're looking at right here. You see, you're looking engine load, map. You know, when you're pulling into it really heavy. All right, and see, there's some more PIDs I put up. There's long-term fuel trim, not too bad. Short-term fuel trim, you know, so look at that. Oxygen sensor, -1 millivolt, you know. See, it's just really looking fairly at O2 sensor 2 is supposed to be lazy. By the way, your one in front of your catalytic converter is supposed to be a lot more active than the one behind it. Just be aware of that, you know. And so there, I just went ahead and put all these up there, open and closed loop. See, when it goes open loop, is what I started to say a while ago, it ignores the oxygen sensor in open loop. That's when the engine is really cold, and that's when you're at wide open throttle, and times like that. When you're at wide open throttle, you don't need nobody jacking with your fuel mixture. You need to get around that semi going up that hill, or somebody comes over here, you know what I'm saying? All right, there's some more little things, see there. He's actually doing this, there's your airflow, grams per second. It looked pretty good too. Vehicle speed was kind of going up, but it was struggling. You know, he's holding 60 miles an hour. And the Ranger barely even noticed the plug exhaust. He did that on the Ranger too. And the scan tool PID didn't show that either. So see, what he was trying to do is he was trying to gather some information about what would this look like, and how can I look at my scan tool data and tell if the exhaust is stopped up, which is a pretty good deal right there. I kind of put you know, several of his screen prints up here. Short fuel trim 1%, long fuel trim 1%. You're not seeing fuel trim reading is different there. And he had plugged the exhaust on the thing. Oh, oxygen sensor 1.1, you know, closed loop right there, but that's when he went into wide open throttle right there. Okay, and so anyway, you can see how those are looking. O2S1 mirrored O2S11. So now basically, you know where the oxygen sensors are, right? O2S11 is always on the #1 bank in front of the catalytic converter, between the cat and the engine. It's the farthest one forward. O21 is the one on bank 2. Now on a Ford, which bank is bank 1? Gonna be where #1 cylinder is. Passenger side. On a Chevy, driver's side. Well, I guess it's got a V8. All right. Now, it's wise to get accustomed to what the scan tool data looks like when there's a vacuum leak, and the effect is obviously slightly different on mass airflow systems than on MAP systems. The red line is at the point where a vacuum leak was introduced. Look at this. They produced a vacuum leak right here. See what the fuel trim did? Started going up. Oxygen sensor went flat. Short fuel trim started going up right away. And this one here started reacting more slowly. See that? This steps up. This one here going like that. And it actually, you notice it brought the oxygen sensor back online. It overcame the vacuum leak by putting more fuel in there. All right. There's your red line where you made the vacuum leak. See that we've gone up there, oxygen sensor 2.1, and see that right there? RPM, lost a little bit right there. This was basically an idle thing. All right, the Envoy, he created that. The PCM closed the throttle plates a little bit. When he closed the throttle plates, can't control engine speed, because whenever you make a vacuum leak on a lot of these fuel injected engines, the engine speed goes up. Unless it's just mostly on one runner. All right, mass airflow and MAP together. Early GM vehicles in the mid-80s dumped MAP in front of favor of MAP when those cars started running bad. The diagnostic was to whack the MAP sensor. I mean, the mass airflow. Well, you said even, and the GM said if you whack it with your knuckles and if it ran bad for a second, you needed one to came out with this retrofit. Now, a lot of platforms have MAP and MAF. Some, like most Chrysler products, you'll have a sensor that looks like that, and it'll have the mass airflow. The Chrysler product for a long time stayed completely away from mass airflow. They just had MAP sensors for a long time. And the MAP's a good way to check for EGR activity, but it can also be used as a backup default in case of mass airflow failure. Now, altitude issues, 21% oxygen, 1% inert gas, and 78% nitrogen. That's oxygen is basically the part that's, you know, the lesser nitrogen, and most of what you're breathing is nitrogen, most of it. And then your inert gases are the, you know, like, and I always say this here, you got about 100,000 molecules of atmosphere and I wanted to know how much carbon dioxide, which is what they claim is causing us problems, and 100,000 molecules of oxygen, of atmosphere, there's only 35 molecules of carbon dioxide, and only one of that 35 is man-made. Did you hear what I was saying there? And the most significant greenhouse gas is water vapor. There's a chart up here on the wall you can look at about that. What are you gonna do, shoot the clouds down? We're getting to know about humidity. Come on, man. All right. Whether it's sea level or top of the mountain ratio changes a little bit. What does change is air pressure. The higher the altitude, the less air pressure is available, and the engine needs an air pressure differential to breathe properly. So the only reason air is going to go from one place to another is you got less pressure here than you do there. That's how when you're pulling out of that cup, you grab a hold of that straw, you seal it with your lips, you make your mouth bigger on the inside, and that causes the pressure to be less on the inside, and the atmosphere pushes that drink into your mouth. That's how that happens. All right, while a turbo might adapt to this change, it's still effective. Modern EFI system can only add and subtract fuel and maintain a 14:1 air-fuel ratio and can't change pressure income into the engine. All vehicles lose power proportionally with altitude. I went on a trip with my mother one time on a 72 Chevrolet that we had, and that thing ran like a scalded dog at sea level, but you get that thing up in the mountains, it would blow your hat off, make you plumb sick of it when you want to pull the hill. And what they do is they actually advance the ignition timing, and they change the fuel mixture, and that negates some of that. Most of them, up to 4,000 feet, don't need any altitude modification, but you get above that, they do. What is the altitude of the rim of the Grand Canyon? 8,000 feet. Hey, Jim.
Hey, I got this.
Okay, let me finish this, and we'll get it up and see what's going on.
Man, you fall off with it real quick.
All right. Hey, open that door right there, so we can put that in here on the wheel. In the old days, vehicles that were going to reside at higher altitude needed altitude modification, you know. On the speed density systems, the barrel pressure is calculated by the MAP sensor. Older Fords with a sensor had a frequency output at sea level. Now, 159 hertz was what those would read. If that particular one was reading like 140 hertz, it would cause the engine to run too lean, because it would think it was at high altitude. And these other things all look a lot like that. When a MAP sensor or barrel reading fails, it usually reflects a higher altitude. And which way will it drive the fuel trims? It basically, even if I'm not going to really do that, drives them up. All right, find a fuel trim related concern and you think you fixed it, do the fuel trim reset, like I said. Short fuel trim, start walking away from zero, you're not done. All right, now this is the last slide. This guy had a fuel trim reading plus 27, put an O2 sensor in it, cleared the memory, went right back, but barometric pressure reading 24 inches, it should be reading nearly 30. So, fix was replace the MAP sensor. That was on a Jeep Cherokee. You got it? That's all.